Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 13th edition of Treasury Market Talks, our thought leadership initiative aimed at providing insight across a diverse set of topics relevant to the overall business environment. We have been honored by the presence of a number of eminent speakers, each an expert in his or her field, who have spoken their mind on topics ranging from geopolitics, central banking, and fiscal policy, just to name a few. Most recently, our call ahead of the US midterm election with former White House staffer Todd Buckles helped us understand political and economic ramifications. And before this, a conversation with Professor Otmar Ising on inflation shed light on a seasoned central banker's approach to the old enemy, which is, of course, inflation. Axis Bank has been instrumental in serving a wide spectrum of customers through its innovative financial solutions and products covering large and mid corporates, SMEs, agriculture, and retail businesses. The bank has leveraged the power of technology to provide uninterrupted services to its customers in the challenging times. Over the years, the bank has emerged as a well respected thought leader within the banking industry. Today, we discuss the great reset currently taking place around us in the geoeconomic flux surrounding the global economy, with special focus on China and India. It is our privilege to introduce Professor Michael Pettis, Professor of Finance at Peking University and a North China expert. And we welcome back Pramit Pal Chaudhary, head of the India practice at the Eurasia Group and a former member of the National Security Board. Pramit was our honored guest at an earlier TMT with Baroness Ashton, formerly of the EU, when the Ukraine war had just started. I also introduced Mr. Neeraj Gambhir, Group Executive, Treasury Markets and Wholesale Banking Products, and a veteran of financial markets over 25 years, spanning fixed income, foreign exchange, capital markets, structured finance, derivatives, risk management, and investment banking. Some housekeeping announcements before we begin. Participation to the webinar is by invitation only. Axis Bank reserves the right to block access to any person to whom an invitation has not been sent. Unauthorized dissemination of the contents of this webinar is strictly prohibited, and prior explicit permission of the bank is imperative. As a reminder, all participant viewing panels will be in the view-only mode. Participants who wish to ask questions may post them in the question box on your screens. Please note that this conference is being recorded and may involve the presence of the press or media. On behalf of Axis Bank, once again, I welcome all our customers to this event. Let me now hand over to Mr. Gambhir.
Thank you, Tanay. Good evening and welcome to all of you to our webinar, 13th session of our Treasury Market Talks series. We are privileged to have Professor Michael Pettis with us. He's someone who's a noted expert on China, based in Beijing currently. I'm hoping that we'll get an insider's view of what's going on in China through this conversation. We are also privileged to have Pramit back with us after a gap of about 9 odd months, I guess. We last had you on this platform, Pramit, in March. That was the time when Ukraine war had just started, and we found your insights quite useful. That's the reason why we decided to have you back. Since the time we did our last seminar on this topic, and the topic for today being the Great Reset, I think a lot of things have changed. First of all, we have this evolving situation in the geopolitics where there is Russia and China on one side, and there is US and allies on the other side. So we are effectively transitioned away from a unipolar world after the demise of Cold War into once again a multipolar or a bipolar at least world for now. And we need to see how that evolves. The second reset that is underway is the whole reset around the supply chains and the global world order of economics, which was kind of a globalization trend after China joined the WTO. It seems like that we are doing somewhat of a reset, and I'm reminded of this term coined by an author, Thomas Friedman, who talked about the world becoming flat. I think the world is becoming curved again. If not twisted, then certainly curved. So part of this conversation is also trying to decipher what happens as a result of that transition. We've also come out of a 2-year, COVID pandemic, and that's had significant impact on the global economies. We are going through another great reset, which is the inflation. After about 2 decades of low or close to zero inflation in the developed world, we are back into high single-digit inflation rates, both in US and Europe. Japan is still in low inflation rate, but a bulk of the world is now in high inflation. So this great reset is playing out there as well. And finally, significant amount of changes happening on the technology front. We all know that. And there is another reset that is going on that space as well. So I am actually, amidst all these changes, amidst all these, big shifts that are happening, I would like to request Professor Pettis to start off with his commentary on how does he see China and the changes that are happening in China, particularly in the wake of the CPC conference that just finished. And it is a big change that is underway currently.
Thanks very much, Neeraj, and thank you, Tane. I think, one of the big problems that we have, those of us who focus on China, and probably economists in general, is that we tend to have a pretty poor understanding of economic history, financial history, and we don't do a very good job sometimes of putting a country like China within the context of developing countries. When you do that, one of the things that often surprises people is that the Chinese growth model, about which so much ink has been spilled, is not particularly Chinese. It's a growth model about which we should know quite a lot. It's basically what I would call a high savings, high investment model. And the theory behind the model is that developing countries have high investment needs, and they tend to have low investment compared to their needs, in part because they tend to have low savings. And so the goal is to increase savings in order to generate higher levels of investment. In the 19th century, a country like the United States basically increased savings by importing savings from England and the Netherlands and the rest of Europe. But that's become a very risky process. So what a number of theorists decided, and probably correctly, is that in order to generate very high levels of domestic investment, you have to push up the savings rate. And many people think high savings is a question of cultural values, thrift, etc. It's really not. If you look at high savings countries, whether it's China, Japan, South Korea, Germany, the Netherlands, etc., what you find in every case is that the household share of GDP, that is the share of GDP distributed to households versus businesses and governments, is very low. And because most consumption is household consumption, if you reduce the share that ordinary people get of what the country produces, you will also reduce the consumption share. And GDP is consumption plus savings. So by definition, you're increasing the savings, the amount that's available for investment. As part of this model, those savings, there are many ways, by the way, of increasing the savings share or reducing the household income share, and we can get into that later. But as part of this model, you have to direct all of these savings into a controllable financial system, let's say the banking system, and the banks have to make these savings easily available for investment. So many countries have done this. You could argue that Germany and the Soviet Union in the 1930s really developed the basic form of this model. But certainly since the Second World War, at least 24 countries have followed this model. Japan followed it. The first country to be called an economic miracle, which was Brazil in the late 50s and 1960s, also followed a version of this model, and so has China. Now, is this model a good one or a bad one? Well, the problem with a lot of these economic debates is that they're quite ideological. In fact, the better question should be, under what conditions is this model a good one, and under what conditions is it no longer a useful model? And it turns out that the answer is not that complicated. If a country has a very high investment need compared to its actual level of investment, this model, by pouring resources into investment, creates very rapid growth. But once a country has more or less achieved the amount of investment that it can productively absorb, that workers and businesses can productively absorb, this model no longer works. So what's the case in China? Well, when China started this, which was in the late 70s, early 1980s, China had gone through 5 decades of anti-Japanese war, civil war, and Maoism. And it was hugely underinvested for its level of social development. So this model was exactly what the doctor ordered by increasing savings as rapidly as possible, by constraining the growth in household income and pouring those savings into the banking system, which turned around and lent them very easily to local businesses and governments for investment purposes. It caused very rapid growth in investment, very rapid growth in productivity, rapid growth in the real economy. So you have this very interesting phenomena, which is key to understanding the problem of China. And that is, for 20 to 30 years, GDP grew quite rapidly at around 10% a year on average. Household income didn't grow nearly as rapidly. It grew at around 7%, which is really good in nominal terms. Most countries would love to have 7% growth in household income. But notice that because it's growing more slowly than GDP, the household income share is getting lower and lower. And that means, by definition, the consumption share is getting lower and the savings share, which is poured into investment, is getting higher. Now, Chinese people didn't complain about these transfers, which were used to subsidize investment, because the economy was growing so quickly that they also continued to do very well, even though as they got a smaller and smaller share of what they produced. The problem with this model, and every single country that has followed this model has run into this problem, is that with such a high growth rate and investment, at some point you close the gap between what you need and what you have. And when that happens, you need to shift your model. Now, how do we know when that happens? Well, it turns out there's a fairly simple way. When you borrow money to invest, if the investment is productive, by definition, the value that investment gives to the economy is greater than the resources used for which you borrowed the money to fund. So while your debt rises, your GDP rises just as quickly. So, many people believe debt started rising 10, 15 years ago, and it's not true. Debt in China has been rising rapidly for 30 years, but we never noticed it because GDP rose just as quickly. But around 2006, 2007, 2008, we saw something in China, which again, I want to repeat, has happened in every single country that's followed this model. And that is that the growth in debt started to accelerate even as the growth in GDP started to decelerate. When debt is only used to fund investment, that cannot happen unless the investment is non-productive. It can happen over short periods, but this has been happening for 15 years. So basically, 10 years, 12 years ago, a few people like me started arguing that China really needed to switch to a very different development model. But we also argue that the historical precedents suggest that it's incredibly difficult to do so. And I think that's where we are today. There is a widespread recognition, developed over the last 3 to 4 years, that this growth model is no longer delivering what the Chinese refer to as high quality growth. It's now delivering enormous amounts of debt and what they don't call, but implicitly they refer to as low quality growth. And that's where we are today. That's where we've been in the last several years.
So how do you see this playing out over the next 10, 15, 20 years? I mean, what's the reset from an economic standpoint that you see China going through?
Well, Niraj, China's a superlative in many ways. It's taken these imbalances to a greater extent than any other country. The lowest consumption rate in history, the highest savings rate in history, the highest investment rate in history, also the most rapid growth in debt in history. So in my opinion, I don't think we should be thinking about 10 or 15 years. China really needs to adjust in the next 5 years or maybe less. It depends where you think its net capacity is. And the adjustment is in a way quite simple. It's institutionally very difficult to implement, but it's quite simple. You have an enormous amount of bad investment. China invests 42% of GDP. To give you an idea, the world invests 25% of GDP roughly, and high investment, rapidly developing countries invest around 30% of GDP. So China invests more, a third more than high investment, rapidly growing developing countries. It's an enormous amount. And that's the source of this tremendous growth in debt, investment in the property sector and investment in infrastructure. So you have to bring it down. You've got to bring down all of this investment. So what can you do? Well, there are a limited number of things you can do. You can theoretically replace bad investment with good investment in the tech sector. We can discuss that later if you want, but that's incredibly impractical. Every country says they'll do it. No one has been able to do it for reasons we can discuss later, but that's one possibility. The next possibility is you can bring down bad investment and replace it with a growing trade surplus. If you're Singapore, maybe you can get away with that strategy. If you're the second largest economy in the world, you can't. The third thing you can do, and this is what they've been talking about since 2007, they haven't been able to do it, is you can bring this bad investment down and replace it with consumption. But remember, consumption in China is the lowest of any country in history because the household income share is very low. So basically, that means if you want consumption to replace investment, you need to boost the consumption share of GDP, which requires that you boost the household income share. Now, I don't need to tell you that if I increase my share, I must reduce your share. And that's the problem. When you go through the various mechanics, the transfer of income, which mostly has to come from the government, to the household sector is incredibly difficult to do. And then that's it. Those are your options. If you bring down investment, you can bring up good investment, you can bring up the trade surplus, you can bring up consumption. If you don't do any of those three things, and none of the countries that followed this model was able to do either of the three, then the result is much lower growth. And there, I'm aware that my answer is a little bit long, but there I think the best country to think about as a model is Japan. Japan had many of these imbalances in the 1970s and 1980s, and they stopped roughly in 1991. And since then, Japan has been very slowly and with great difficulty adjusting at a growth rate of roughly 0.5% annually. I think that's what we have to think about when we think about China. Let me stop there.
No, that's very helpful. Pramit, let me get you into this conversation. I mean, this internal adjustment of China and its impact on the rest of the world. I mean, your initial comments.
So I think I'm not the macroeconomist that Michael is, so I'm not going to go down into that much detail. But yes, I think it's a mixture in India's case of us becoming more competitive, especially in the manufacturing sector. We've always been reasonably competitive in services because of major reforms at home that we've seen, especially over the past roughly 10 years, combined with a geopolitical element in which the United States and to a lesser extent a few other Western countries, I think Japan comes to mind, have got a belief or believe that it is important to maintain a degree of balance of power in Asia, and boosting India is one of the means to, or a key means to do so. India has been a horribly uncompetitive manufacturer for decades. We have cheap labor, but we never had very much of anything else. A lot of that has changed. It's still got a while to go, but we've seen a whole series of reforms, lowering of corporate tax rates, the introduction of a nationwide sales tax, and we've seen a huge increase in government investment in infrastructure. Simple things like the e-way bill, which allowed us to digitalize the movement of containers across the country, and across state borders, and so on, and a lot of smaller little changes here and tweaks that have been going on. I think if you look at reports by Deloitte and various others, where in the past, if you put Chinese competitiveness in manufacturing at about 100, Vietnam at roughly at about 80 or 85, India was lagging in the 60s. Now we're probably within, probably starting to nudge 6 or 7 points below Vietnam. And in electronics, we're starting to see a little bit of that starting to show up. Where India bridges the gap is the geopolitical risk. Where companies are coming in, and I think Apple is probably the best example, saying, we will maintain everything we do in China, but we have a problem that the apps we make in China, the phones we make in China, are increasingly now coming under the scanner in places like the United States. So, and potentially supply chain disruption in Northwest Asia over something like Taiwan means we need to find an alternative place to go. Now, China plus strategies are well spoken of almost every all over the world. In some cases, and I think Apple is a perfect example, they really focus much more on India than any other place. Partly, I would argue, because Washington is telling them, please look at India for geopolitical reasons. India makes more sense to us. There's another additional factor. Apps, for example, India is quite good at it, very competitive. Now, it's interesting now we're starting to see the Taiwanese companies start to arrive at the lower end, for example, of chips, and citing the same reason. We've been told we have to come here. So this gives India an amazing opportunity. Geopolitical risk by itself in the long term is not, in my view, sufficient reason for a large number of companies to come. You're not going to get many European companies to come, for example. But it gives you a platform. And if you can continue maintaining reforms in India at home, and we still have a few more to go, you then begin to close the gap on Vietnam. You throw in the fact that India has software capacities that Vietnam, I would argue, does not have. You then become genuinely competitive in a sort of in a set of integrated technologies. So we have that opportunity right now to see that coming in. Now, JP Morgan, for example, has issued a report saying they think that by 2025, a quarter of all the iPhones in the world will be made in India. And I visited the Foxconn facilities, for example, that are coming up in South India, and they are impressive and many ways mimic what they've already done in China. Lots of young rural women, small town women being the bulk of the workforce, a lot of the structures that they've developed in China. They said you still need a bit of work on the infrastructure. It's still nowhere as good as the amazing stuff that you see in China. But on the other hand, the software capacities in India are better. But we have to build on this. And I think but the value addition is what I'm looking at. If we play the cards right, and if India can continue the reforms, the value addition, even now with the iPhones being assembled really, and some of the components being made in India, the vast bulk are still made in China. We're looking at a value addition of maybe 15, max 20% per phone. If we can jump to chipsets and maybe one day to really the top-end chips, then the value addition in India could actually surpass what, for example, an Apple iPhone manufactured in China is. And that would be genuinely transformational. But it depends on a lot of domestic actions besides what happens overseas.
It's very interesting. China looking to switch from an investment-led model to some bit of consumption. India has always been a good consumption story. And now we are looking to boost our investment using this new world order, right? I think this is kind of a bit of a rotation between the two countries of what the growth model is. Michael, if I come back to you, this whole issue of supply chain disruptions, the supply chain changes that geopolitics is actually kind of forcing people to think about. China has been the factory of the world, right? This whole investment-led cycle that you talked about was essentially about becoming a cheap supplier of components, productive capital, whatever you call it, to the rest of the world. In the new world order that we're looking at, how easy it is for the rest of the world to sort of wean themselves away from this Chinese dependence from your perspective, right? Is it possible? How do you see this trend kind of play out?
I think there are some misconceptions about why a country like China has become the factory of the world. By the way, it's not just China. It's China, Germany, Japan, Vietnam, the Netherlands, all of the countries that have run persistent trade surpluses. Their share of global manufacturing has expanded. Even relative to their share of global GDP. Whereas you'll see that deficit countries, their share of global manufacturing has contracted. And why is this the case? Well, if you speak to the Chinese or the Germans, they'll politely mention that they are very thrifty, hardworking people. And that explains their export success and their manufacturing success. And once again, I would like to argue that that completely misunderstands it. In every one of those countries, you will see very clearly that the household share of GDP is much lower than among their trading partners. And why is that important? It's important because basically the households are required directly and indirectly to pay enormous subsidies to the manufacturing sector. The direct subsidies are pretty substantial. There was a study done by CSIS in Washington, which looked at 7 major economies, 8 including the US, and looked at the level of direct subsidies provided to the manufacturing sector. And I think neither you nor Pramit will be surprised to hear that direct subsidies in China exceeded that of all other countries, including India. In fact, they were more than twice as high as in the second highest country, which was South Korea. That matters. What also matters is we talked about infrastructure. China has an infrastructure problem in the sense that it has probably the best infrastructure in the world. Now, that may not seem like a problem, but infrastructure has a value, and the value of infrastructure depends on the productivity of those who use it, which is just another way of saying that rich countries should have better infrastructure than poor countries. And there is an optimal amount of infrastructure. I think we would all agree that Indian infrastructure is well below whatever that optimal amount is. But it's also the case that infrastructure in China, both transportation and logistics, is much better than can be economically justified. However, the way that is distributed is very uneven. Very good infrastructure, transportation and logistic infrastructure, is great if you're a business. It's terrible if you're an ordinary Chinese household. And we see in China, consumption simply isn't able to grow because household income isn't able to grow, even though GDP continues to inch forward. And the reason is because of all of these direct and indirect subsidies. So when people tell me that they believe that we'll see a major reshoring of manufacturing out of China, I say you have to be a little bit careful. We're not in China. Manufacturers are not in China because of any, particularly preference for Chinese styles or Chinese workers. They're there, very frankly, because of these enormous direct and indirect subsidies. And I would argue that countries that don't match them can never be as internationally competitive. Now, will this continue forever? Well, the irony is that China's strength in exports is the flip side of its very weak domestic demand. Because remember, if households consume very little, then domestic demand is weak. But the flip side of it is manufacturing exports are very competitive. And so you can export a great deal. So China is locked in this process where they want exports to be strong, but they want domestic demand to go up, which is impossible. You have to give up one or the other. And until China makes the very, very difficult adjustments they will be more competitive than other countries within our current system of globalization. Now, globalization itself is changing, so the story may be very different in a few years. But right now, I think it's very hard for other countries, even countries like Vietnam, to compete with Chinese manufacturing. They simply don't have the level of direct and indirect subsidies.
Yeah, I mean, I think India is trying to do a bit of that, but not at the scale. Our PLI schemes, to some extent, are effectively a response to that kind of subsidy system that you talked about, right? And I think in some areas, PLI is starting to have a little bit of an impact. Pramit, I want to get back to you with a question around geopolitics. I think nowadays, particularly post-Ukraine, I think we are starting to hear this construct of return of Cold War era, right? Now, I mean, my perception is that if you look at US-China relationship, it's very different from what the US-Russia relationship or US-USSR relationship at the peak of Cold War. There was literally no interdependence between US and USSR, and between China and US, there's a huge amount of interdependence, right? But we are seeing some things actually happen. For example, the CHIPS Act, right? It's a very clear articulation by US of saying that we don't want to export technology to China. So how do you see this new Cold War? Is this a political Cold War or is this a technological Cold War? I mean, how would you ascribe this?
So yeah, so I think exactly that. The real difference or the curious nature of 21st century geopolitics, especially between US and China, is about the technology. When I have spoken to American officials in the national security system, even in this administration and even the previous one, they've all had come to the same conclusion. We're not while it's not impossible, the likelihood of a military conflict between the US and China is relatively low. Neither side has any interest in going down that path. It does not make any sense for two countries of that size. And as you said, both of them would suffer dramatically economically as a consequence because of their own dependence. What they are looking at and what they believe is that it is future technologies that will determine, I wouldn't say, but hegemony, but more preeminence and the ability, therefore, to win over other countries and dominate perhaps supply chains. And these critical technologies, and you can see what they are because the Quad is deliberately not a military alliance. It draws out of this idea that the future of, should we say, global competition is going to be about who has a certain dominance or preeminence in key technologies. And of the 26 working groups within the Quad, for example, which 23 of them are about those types of technologies, and they keep adding more. And it's important to realize it's not about, I know there's a lot of talk about decoupling. It's not so much necessarily about we want to sever the supply chains between these two countries. That's happening to some degree. As much as to be able to say that the other country does not have the ability to put us under the gun because of its strength, its capacity and technology. And the Quad effectively represents 4 countries which have decided that being potentially under the supply chain dominance of China is unacceptable. Therefore, the battle there now is about these technologies. Now, it's a battle in the sense that you can't completely ever break away from the other side. And I don't think that either country really wants that to happen. But at the cutting edge. So what you're really going to be seeing is decoupling, if it happens, will be what happens in the future over the next 5-10 years in something like artificial intelligence, potentially green hydrogen, chips getting a lot of emphasis largely because of the present disruption. But chips is really a huge global supply chain with several bits and pieces concentrated in several countries, the Netherlands, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and so on. So nobody can really break through that. But I really think it's going to be the infusion technologies that cut across several different types of, or across the economy, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. These are going to be the real struggle. what already exists today, automobiles and toys and stuff, I don't see that ever decoupling. It doesn't even make any sense, not even strategic. Neither government is concerned about those things. That is largely going to be left to the market forces. Whatever, or you put it another, whatever's under the WTO today is going to be more or less remain the same. That type of trade will continue. It's the future technologies that matter, and those are going to be highly contentious, partly because a lot of the governments don't fully understand how to control them. So you're going to see some very bizarre decisions along the way. You're also going to see a lot of pointless investments. We're already seeing that with chips. The amount of investment and subsidies pouring into high-end chips across the world, a lot of that is going to go to waste because there's simply not that much demand for those type of chips. But that's just the nature of strategic competition because it's not driven by commercial interests. But yes, I see technology in a very narrow but a very important way over the next 10, 15 years at the heart of geopolitical tension between and competition between US and China. And India has very clearly decided that its future lies with with the United States, and that in the Quad and so on, you're starting to see India drift much, much closer to that overall.
Yeah. China has been also playing a slightly different game in the sense that, this future dominance or dominance over future technology is also about, for example, battery technologies, right? And the minerals that are required for having the chips, the chips manufacturing capacity. And there has been a lot of investments in low-income countries, for example, Africa, Asia, some of the Asian countries. There has been OBOR, initiative of China. Michael, what do you make out of these going forward? I think there is, in some senses, we don't hear about OBOR as much as we used to, say, about 2 years ago. And similarly, these investments that China has made to get the minerals, for example, the dominance of minerals. I mean, there seems to be clearly a race to get to that as well.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. BRI or OBOR is a very interesting question. Again, when it's put within a historical context, when I came to China, there was enormous talk about huge Chinese investments in various developing countries. There were some pretty astonishing claims made about these investments that somehow China had figured out in a way that Japan, the US, and Europe hadn't, how to make productive investments in developing countries. It was extremely successful at that. And because I come from a developing country background, when I worked on Wall Street, I specialized in trading Latin American and developing country debt. I recognize many of the countries that China was especially successful in. In Latin America, these included Argentina, Ecuador, Venezuela. In Asia, they included your neighbor Pakistan and a number of countries in Africa. And what occurred to me at looking at all of these countries is, I recognize these countries. These are the countries that commercial lenders are very wary about lending money to. And looking sort of more generally on the Chinese investment project, I was very lucky because one of my former students, I've been teaching at one or the other of the top 2 universities in China for 20 years, and I'm very close to some of my students. And one of them, I don't want to talk too much about him, but he was involved in a government entity responsible for a lot of the lending to Latin America and to Africa. And we spoke many, many times about that process. And what I told them 10 years ago was that what China was doing reminded me of previous cases of what the US was doing in the 1920s. The US in the 1920s, for example, that's when it first started going out financially. It went after British interests in Latin America. It was extremely successful in pushing the British out of most countries except Argentina. And we said, it's because we're smarter, we understand. And the Brits said, no, it's because you guys don't understand risk. In the 1930s, we discovered the Brits were right. It was very easy to lend the money. It was very hard to get it back. The Soviet Union did something very similar in the 1950s. The Arab OPEC nations in the 1970s, Japan in the 1980s. In every case, you saw a massive increase in lending to developing countries, often to the worst developing credits. The flip side of that was massive exports to those countries, and a lot of this perception that we've figured out how to do it correctly. And then there's always sort of the hangover. And I would argue that the hangover or the crisis really occurred a while ago. It occurred in 2015 with Venezuela. Venezuela found itself unable to repay its debt, of which half of it was Chinese. And I remember meeting with friends, again, this particular friend, there was a real sense of shock. This wasn't supposed to happen. And of course it did. And since then, if you look at Chinese development lending, it sort of peaked in 2015, 2016, and ever since it's come down. China is not going to back away from BRI because this is a program very closely associated with Xi Jinping. But I think there is a new sobriety about it. I think we're going to see much less expansion in developing countries because the Chinese have discovered what a lot of us have discovered, that it's quite easy to lend money to very risky borrowers. It's a completely different story getting the money back. So I think we're not going to be talking about OBOR and BRI in the future nearly as much as we have in the past.
That's a very interesting perspective. I think that's something that we as lenders know very, very well, right? We've gone through many of these cycles. Pramit, in this new geopolitical setup and China plus one strategy, and the fact that there is, some redrawing of lines, associations, affiliations, what do you think we are doing right as India? I mean, we obviously have some stuff going on with us, which is basically PLI kind of schemes to pull in investment from outside. We've done some, some smart stuff, I would say. But is it smart enough? Do we need to do more? What's your perspective on our game plan in this whole evolving situation?
I think there are on a couple of points. One, the geopolitics is more or less right in the sense that in a broad polarization between US and China, we are drifting towards America, but we are making sure that we maintain, should we say, a delicate relationship with China in the sense that the Indian system, and I've talked to our experts in China, are very careful to say that while China will prod you, test you, they normally won't go beyond a certain point as long as you don't basically make the system lose face. If you corner the Chinese leadership in a public manner, you tend to make it almost difficult for the Chinese to walk back, and then you can often get caught into really bad positions. So the Indian Chinese system is contentious, but it seems to work within a certain set of rules. Now, as China has become much more powerful, we've started to see the Chinese sometimes spill outside the rules. The Galwan Valley military clash, where we actually saw people being killed, soldiers being killed on both sides, was very unusual. But the Indian government maintains that degree of relationship. In addition, what the Indian government does is it accepts that certain countries, notably Russia, has a sufficient desire to maintain a degree of independence with China that can actually be exploited. So as I asked one diplomat, I said, how do we deal with the Russians? He said, we do two things. We make sure they get some money and we treat them with a certain degree of respect, because they're really hurting at the fact that they're no longer a superpower, but they also are a little on the greedy side. So we give them a bit of money, give them a bit of investment, we talk them up a bit. And what that does is, more than anything else, ensures that Russia is neutral when India and China go head to head. So you play this careful game because India is very clear and very conscious of the fact that it is still a poor country. And whatever the size of its GDP in per capita terms, it doesn't have an indigenous defense industry. It lacks on so many fronts. Indian officials are banned from describing their country as even a great power. They're just told use euphemisms like Vishwa Guru, which just means universal teacher. It doesn't mean anything. But the Indian government is very clear: we're not a great power, and we're not officially declaring ourselves to be one. So it's a very quiet winter. When I've talked to I talk to Chinese, and I mention this. They say, "Oh, this is like Deng Xiaoping's philosophy: try to keep a certain low profile, even as you slowly play the game." And in addition, what we're seeing is as America deliberately sheds portions of the world and says that we're no longer want to get involved in these parts of the world, Central Asia to some degree, Persian Gulf definitely, and China and others don't really fill that vacuum. We've been able to exploit some of those to get some advantages for ourselves, or at least get leverage in a way that India didn't have before. And I think the Gulf is probably the best example of that, where we now have a very different relationship with the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, where we used to be effectively just the place you would go and send workers to. We're now seen much more strategically. It's allowed us to isolate countries, our traditional rivals like Pakistan. And so on a whole host of these fronts. But keep in mind, this is still on a relatively small platform. India has been very careful about how much money it provides. It does not have that much money. It prefers to, especially in Africa, for example, help the private sector go in rather than have the government move in. So India is the third largest, depending on how you measure it, probably the third largest FDI investor in Africa. But it's almost all private sector, and it's scattered. And sometimes it's even hard to tell that it's Indian. When the Tata Group invests in Africa, it does so via the Tata subsidiaries in England. So it's officially British investment, even though it's wholly owned by an Indian company. And the Indian government is perfectly fine with that. They believe it's much better to maintain a low profile and slowly keep moving onwards. And the fact, I would say, that we have more or less a good or cordial relationship or constructive relationship with almost every major country in the world today. And a relationship that in some cases, like in the case of the United States, where India came and said, look, we have to buy Russian oil at a discount and we have to maintain a relationship with Russia. Washington basically said, we accept that, we understand it, go ahead. That's the kind of leverage we get out of playing this game right now, but it's a difficult game to play. We'll see how well we can sustain this and for how long.
Pramit, since I have you and I can't help asking this question, even though we are maybe a little bit over time for now, what do you see is the possibility of an escalated military conflict between China and US, particularly around Taiwan, right? That's the joker, and that's the elephant in the room, right? That we all think about.
So, as I said, I don't think either government has any interest in doing so. What my sense, though, is repeatedly, I'm hearing of incidents where whenever these two decide to become a little bit more forward in their rivalry with each other, you hear of ships coming very close to each other. You hear of errors being in the intelligence structure of boats and interpreting what the other side is saying. And we've seen a series that I think that during the Trump administration, there are a number of incidents that I know of where both sides, especially, I would say come close to war, but they came very close to misunderstanding what the other side was doing. And I think one of the things that has happened recently is, and you saw that at the G20 in Bali, where Biden and Xi met, is that both governments recognized this problem. And they basically said, we have to tamp down some of what's happening on the ground. And I think that that's fine. I don't think the Chinese are interested or even believe they can invade Taiwan. And if there's one lesson, I hope they have learned from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, offensive wars are much, much more difficult to wage than people realize. So I don't see that happening. An accidental, not so much as a war, but an accidental military incident of some variety is not impossible. And you've seen that in the past where, for example, an American spy plane collided with a Chinese fighter. Didn't trigger a war, but it happened during the Bush administration. If it were to happen today, it would cause a lot more international concern than it did in the past.
Look, I can go on and on. This is such a fascinating topic, but realize that we are already 50 minutes into our conversation. So I need to leave some time for our questions from the folks who are on the call. How do you want to do this, Tanay? We ask questions?
Yeah, I'll ask them out. So there's a question from Durga Dhar to begin with, from Bajaj Alliance. To what extent is high global inflation due to deglobalization? And is this possibly the reverse of what happened in the past 20 years when China's entry into the global trading system caused low inflation? And how long can this last?
Michael, your perspective, please, as an economist.
Yeah, the way I look at the world, the problem that we've been suffering for the last 30 years has really not been a problem of excess demand, but rather insufficient demand propped up by increases in debt. And the way to think about it is assume there are two countries, Germany and Spain, to be non-controversial. If Germany represses domestic demand to make its export sector more competitive, that is, if Germany forces up its savings rate, globally savings and investment must balance. So either Spanish investment must go up, which no longer happens in developing countries. I'm sorry, in developed economies, they're no longer constrained by the lack of savings, or domestic savings must go down, or GDP must go down. I don't want to be too pedantic, but my point is that the way the world has responded to these very large persistent surpluses is with rising debt and rising income inequality. Now, for me, the key issue is not so much, we've seen inflation temporarily, and there's still a very big debate about whether the inflation is caused by temporary supply constraints driven by COVID, or whether it's caused by excessive demand driven by massive payments from governments to households in Europe or the US. But what I would argue is that whatever the reason is, it's probably temporary. What we've seen before in history is that periods of very low inflation or disinflation are often associated with rising income inequality for very obvious reasons. And for me, we're not really going to go into an inflationary world until we see a major redistribution of income. And even if that happens, that's not necessarily inflationary. It depends how that happens. But right now, demand is still so weak that I would argue inflation is largely driven by supply disruptions. And it may take us another couple of years to get through it, but the core problem continues to be weak demand, particularly in China. Demand here is extremely weak, and there seems to be nothing they can do to get domestic demand to rise.
Okay, thanks, Professor Pettis. There's one more from Rasik Shah of Reliance. He asks, what are the areas of overlap between geoeconomic interests of India and others? What are the red lines? What are the opportunities and threats?
Amit, you would like to take this?
Sure. So I think as we've discussed, the obvious overlap we have is broadly with the US and Japan in particular over ensuring that China is not the preeminent player or developer, innovator of certain types of technology. There are some technologies that I think India has a good chance within that cohort of becoming a major player. We're still not a major source of technology. But what we do bring is a huge amount of manpower. If you look at, for example, artificial intelligence in America, roughly a quarter to one third of all of the AI workers in the United States are of Indian origin, and virtually one out of every three AI graduates in India go to the United States. And when I've talked to American officials, they'll point this out and they'll say that without the Indian supplement to America, America would not be able to compete or maintain its present position in artificial intelligence. So there is the overlap is very evident. It's not necessarily so evident in something like, let's say, green hydrogen, because that's much more built around the energy structure, if you wish, of different economies. And a lot of that is going to be about standards. So you can see it, for example, the Quad has not been able to come together, or so far has shown no evidence of a combined stand on green hydrogen standards. Because, for example, America, it would be perfectly legitimate for America to argue that green hydrogen doesn't even make sense for them. LNG plus carbon sequestration technology would be probably a better fit for what America's energy structure is. India, on the other hand, India might be better off matching its green hydrogen standards to, let's say, Japan or even Germany, rather than the United States. So a lot of countries, including India, are trying to figure out where they fit into all of these different technologies. And we'll see where that goes. But I think the most clear sign right now of one area we've decided where we're going is 5G. The 5G rollout of India had its origins in many ways. Was in the Quad, where India said, okay, we are prepared to do the 5G rollout. We want technology. We need assistance here. And we need to get some standards. What we don't want is Chinese technology. We don't want telecom gear from China, ZTE, and Huawei banned. But how do we do this? So Japan's NEC, American Qualcomm, and various other companies have basically had already worked out a US-Japan 5G structure. And the Quad said, take this as your template, and we'll see that you get access to the technologies required. And then we fitted in the various, the Ericssons and the Nokias and so on. But it was a 5G structure that was completely ex-China. I mean, there was nothing in it that was Chinese. But we'll see. There are other areas where I think electrical vehicles is an area where China's dominance is so massive that I'm not certain that anybody is going to be able to ever break away from what China dictates on that front. And I don't think China necessarily will use that against anybody, but they'll just say, you just have to buy some of the stuff from us. And we'll always, so far, I don't see how anybody over the next 10 or 20 years is going to be able to break that dominance. And we'll have to live with that.
Thanks, Pramit. I'm going to combine a few questions asked by Nitin Parikh of Hindalco and Kotak Securities, among others. So, zero COVID will at some point end, but when will it? And once that ends, will China find that the environment is irretrievably changed? All the low-hanging fruits are already picked. Debt is high. The housing sector is probably not very strong at this point in time. Prices might not be going up anymore. What sort of, and of course, demographics don't look very good. So it's going to be very hard to shift towards domestic consumption. How do the Chinese think they'll be able to do this? Is there any policy in the works?
So Tan, it's a complex question. Let me break it down in two parts. First,
Yes.
I know Pramit has an interesting theory around the zero COVID. So I'm not going to put Michael on the spot on this one, but let me start with Pramit to hear or rather him say his take on zero COVID in China. And then we'll come back to Michael about this whole concept of how do we switch the gears on consumption versus investment.
Okay, well, I won't go into what I think Chinese government's response will be in the future because I'm not that familiar with that. But I will just say on zero COVID, based on a number of independent studies that have been done on the Chinese COVID situation, they've kind of painted themselves in a corner. The government cannot admit that Sinovac and Sinopharm are not very effective vaccines, which lose efficacy very fast. They've not allowed COVID to rip through the population, for example, as it has done in India. So the two primary sources of immunity to COVID are simply don't exist in China. Depending on which kind of analysis you read, the actual effective immunization rates in China at any given point may be as low as 15%. The problem there is that the Chinese government has to admit that its vaccines don't work, and then has to figure out how to import vaccines of a different variety, which is what they've been trying to do in a sort of indirect way. We're trying to get mRNA technology imported in. But if you're caught between an unwillingness to admit some of your past claims, but you don't really have a way to get mass immunization or immunity in your population other than allowing the disease to spread, you get kind of trapped in the zero COVID policy then just goes on forever, or you have to slowly allow that zero COVID policy to sort of erode over time. But how you do that without a considerable loss of life or infection is not clear to me. And I'm not certain it's clear to the Chinese government either.
Michael, if you wish to comment on that, but more importantly, I would like to hear your thoughts about what needs to be done to switch the tracks on investment versus consumption. You spoke about it a little bit earlier, but I think exactly what policies do you see Chinese government following to make that transition happen?
Sure. Let me start first by congratulating Pramit on his answer, because as far as I'm aware, he's really gotten to the point. In China, to allow COVID to spread would cause so many fatalities. But the real concern is that China simply doesn't have enough doctors and nurses to handle the inflow into the hospitals. And what they are politically terrified of seeing is what we saw, for example, in Hong Kong, people outside hospitals begging to be allowed in with their dying mothers, things like that. And I'm not really sure there's a way around that yet. So it's a real mess. They're damned if they do and damned if they don't. As for, switching towards a more of a consumption-oriented economy, it's incredibly difficult. Think about what kind of country India would be if for 40 years you had an extreme version of this particular development model with soaring real estate prices, enormous amounts of money poured into investment in infrastructure and in property, etc. What you would end up seeing is that all of your business, political, financial, and even household institutions become reoriented around this very powerful growth model. And that's always the problem. Albert Hirschman, one of my favorite economists, wrote about this in the Latin American context in the 1960s and 70s. He said the problem is not that they're too dumb to figure out what they need to do. The problem is that this growth model has been so successful, and the constituencies that benefited disproportionately have become so powerful that it's very hard to shift to a different model. So if you were to ask what should China do, it's quite simple. They should implement policies that basically transfer income from local governments to the household sector. They can be direct payments, they can be an improvement in the pension funds, they can even be such a thing as make the subway free. That's a transfer from the subway authorities to the household sector. It can be strengthening the social safety net. It can be eliminating the hukou system, which is a residential requirement that makes migrant workers basically second-class citizens. They can't organize for higher wages, etc. There are a lot of changes. But as soon as or one thing that's much talked about, local governments, instead of selling land for luxury apartments, of which we have way too many in China, most of them empty, they should be developing cheap housing and giving it away or selling it very cheaply to the poor. There are a lot of ways you can do this, but as soon as you examine each one, you realize that it involves a significant shift of the distribution of political, financial, and business power. So when you look at countries that have tried to make this shift, it's always taken a very long time. Japan, 30 years later, is still trying to shift towards a consumption-based economy. They've barely succeeded. They haven't succeeded. It's quite tough to do. And as economists, it's very hard for us to understand why, because the economics are quite simple, quite straightforward. I can tell you what to do. Anyone can tell you what to do. The difficulty, it turns out, is the transformation in the whole set of institutions, business, political, financial, etc., that needs to happen at the same time. So, for example, real estate prices in China are 3 times what they are in the rest of the world as a share of GDP. It's very easy to say, China, we need to see household prices drop by at least 50%, possibly more. But you can imagine the trauma that creates to the banking system and to the wealthy who own apartments. It's quite difficult to do.
I'm just going to take a minute more on this one. So is common prosperity another way of pushing that consumption story?
At the margin, common prosperity is an attempt to solve the American problem in China. And by the American problem, in the US, we have a problem with the distribution of income. The rich get too large a share and the poor too small a share. In the US, 80% of GDP is household income. So if there is a problem in the distribution of income, it will be in the distribution of household income. In countries like India, Europe, it's 70 to 80%, right? Household income is most of GDP. In China, household income is about 55% of GDP. So there is terrible income inequality. But even if you redistribute it downwards, the problem is still that households will retain too low a share of GDP. It'll be slightly better because if you take money from the rich and give it to the poor, consumption immediately rises. But it's not enough. The real transfer has to be from local governments. And so far, they're very reluctant to address that problem. That'll be probably the key problem over the next 3 to 4 years. But for now, they've been really reluctant to touch it.
Sure. Tanay, do you have any more questions?
Yes, I actually have a couple if we have time. If we have time.
I'm going to ask Michael and Pramit, can we go on for maybe another 5 odd minutes?
As long as you like.
Okay.
I'm fine.
Thank you. Thank you. Tanay?
Thanks. So once from Srinivas Singaraju, a Coromandel in Hyderabad. We've spoken about India's strategic priorities in terms of supply chain and manufacturing and, being a part of the global economy in terms of producing things. What about the priorities in terms of getting things? Say, in terms of resources, in terms of know-how, intellectual property, the right connections. What are we doing with regard to that, and where are we as of now?
Okay, so getting things is a somewhat broad phrase, but I'll look at some of those things that you've mentioned specifically. I would say that on resources, India is doing as badly as it always has. Despite repeated attempts by the government to change the mining policies domestically, we're still not getting anywhere because mining is a 30-year cycle in terms of getting genuine funds coming in and profits coming in. But the disruptions that mining causes in a densely populated country like India are immediate in terms of people being displaced, environmental damage being caused. So in a 5-year election cycle, and remember, mining is a state subject, it's not a central government subject under the Constitution, no state government wants to touch it. They're like, I will get political damage in elections that are coming up 3-4 years from now, but the money that the state will benefit from and the jobs that will be created will become 20-25 years down the line. So forget it. So we're struggling on that front, and this is why you see more attempts, at least in oil and gas, to go offshore rather than on land. The governments try to front load the benefits financially for state governments in the new mining policies. Still no major takers. And we'll see. I'm not certain that's ever going to change. What are we doing overseas? Marginally better in the sense, again, compared to India's very, very low successes in this area. What we're seeing is where we've benefited the most has curiously been countries inviting us to take over resources. So Sudan came to us and said, we're being sanctioned by the West. Could you like to take over a share of the oil fields, the so-called Greater Nile project? Didn't work out in the end, in the sense that later on Sudan failed to pay the dividends that we were supposed to have gotten to pull out. But we ended up partnering with China as a consequence. Other countries have come in and said, look, we don't want to have China take over everything. Especially this has been true in Africa. So would you happily take a 25% or 30% share in this? Russia has been a country that has been particularly willing or welcoming for Indian investment, partly because of that reason. We actually make so much money, normally would make so much money from dividends from our investments in Russian energy fields, that it actually almost pays for the defense military equipment that we get from Russia. The Russian relationship doesn't even cost us that much in many ways. Mozambique, we are a big holder of offshore gas fields. But one thing it's not clear, I think, on resources is that India is not so good in trying to figure out how to necessarily get that stuff directed into the Indian economy. And I'm not certain that's even possible. So we may be a big investor in Russia, but that oil and gas doesn't come to India in a normal scenario. It goes to China or Japan and Korea. We just make the money from it. And of course, we contribute to the greater global supply of oil, and that helps moderate prices and we gain. Minerals, we have just begun that process. When you're looking at critical or strategic minerals, so-called rare earths and so on, we're barely in the game. Partly because we just have limited capacities, both diplomatically and financially. Indian private sector really has to go out and become a player, but we don't have too many big mining companies in the private sector. Intellectual property is an interesting game. Until now, we've been a player in global south sort of standards where we say basically, people need to give us the technology for free because we're a poor country. We're now seeing a degree of innovation in India. The startups, companies investing a little bit more in R&D, and the government realizing that a lot of Indian, for example, entrepreneurs or inventors who develop things, then take that invention and run off to the West or even run off to Singapore because they look at India's IPR laws and say, well, we have no protection here. It makes no sense. Now, with at least a nascent startup ecosystem developing, we're hoping to see, or starting to see, it's hard to get their clear numbers on this, a lot of that staying in India for the first time. Scaling that up, however, to a full-scale company, that's not happening. We're kind of like Israel. We do the startup, and then after a while, the guys just sell out. But that's okay. That's a first step in that direction. Even now, a lot of the startups you'll see are sort of heavy on e-commerce and so on, which are not necessarily cutting-edge technologies, but the algorithms are starting to be there, and we're starting to see that front. We're starting to see some movement on that front, and I hope we can sustain it. But as you probably know, India is still a difficult place to do business, and we still need to do a lot more on that front. I'm not too sure there are other resources, or there are a lot of other, quote, resources, but I think one to watch out for will be issues that are going to be much closely developed or bothered by climate issues. And these include agriculture, land, water. Water is something India needs to do a lot more on. That's one resource. We are genuinely water-stressed nation, but we also waste a lot of water. Delhi has more water per capita than Paris. Paris doesn't have a water problem. Delhi does. And it's because we waste a lot of it and we don't know how to handle it properly. That stuff has to be worked out. And I've worked in government panels on this issue, and the biggest problem we have is a multiplicity of jurisdictions on water, state, municipal, local, central, whatnot, and they just will not work together. And that has to be a political call at some point, but it's something we've just begun working on.
Thanks. I'll just bring up the last question. This is to Professor Pettis. How is the US CHIPS Act seen in China? Is it something that has real bite, or is it just seen as some sort of posturing for now? Is it concerning?
I'm not a semiconductor expert, but the people that I do speak with say that this has been a very, very difficult move for China. And you can see the response in China has been, almost on the edge of frantic. There is a real concern that this will undermine the Chinese chip industry. I wish I could say more. I wanted to say one other thing, if you don't mind. And this was in reference to Indian growth prospects. Earlier, Pramit mentioned that wages in India are much lower than they are in China, and of course they are. But I think the real difference between India and China there, and between China and most other countries, is that the gap between wages between China and India is smaller than the gap between workers' productivity, which means that although wages are lower in India, labor is more expensive in India. And a lot of people find that hard to believe, because if you're talking about simply assembling, for example, a toy, how is it possible that a Chinese worker can do it better or more quickly than an Indian worker? And that's not where the difference is. They can do it exactly the same. The difference is that if you have to move this toy or whatever it is around from 3 or 4 different locations in different cities, and then ship the toy when it's completed to a port, that's the really big difference between India and China, and between China and most other countries. So much money has been spent on logistics and infrastructure that it is much cheaper for a Chinese manufacturer at the end of the day to produce the completed good than it would be for an Indian manufacturer. That's really the difference. And so it seems to me that the key issue for India, and again, it's easy for an economist to say it, the real devil is in the details, but the real key issue for India is how do you reduce the logistical cost of producing whatever it is, a toy or an iPhone or etc.
Thanks, Professor Pettis. Yes, it is very hard as an economist to explain unit labor costs to most people. It's a little mind bending. Okay. There are many more questions, but I don't want to take up your time. So I'll call for an end to this, but we might send you emails with some more questions afterwards. Thank you very much, Professor Pettis and Mr. Pal Chaudhary and Mr. Gambhir, for your insights developed over the decades, which are especially relevant now. We look forward to all of our customers joining us soon for the next edition of our Treasury Market Talks. A recording of this call will be available in case you wish to have this passed on to your colleagues. Do connect with the relationship managers for any assistance in this regard. Once again, thank you for joining us. You may now log out of the call.
Thank you.
Thank you.